Was there a housing experience or place that you live that made you say, like, hey, this is not work?
Hello, and yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. This is actually the first time that me and Luca have met in person, which is crazy because we're messaging all the time on Signal.
I think it's going well.
Yeah, can't confirm. But yeah, no, that's a great question to start off with, sort of how I came to this space. So I grew up in Southern Maryland, in Calvert County, which is a very rural place, ex-urban, I guess. And I often dreamed about, like, biking to my friend's house. One time my mom and I tried to walk to the closest grocery store, which was this tiny little family-owned grocery store that has a cow statue on the roof as, like, its claim to fame. So that's the kind of place Calvert County is. And that was like a, 3-mile walk with no sidewalk sort of thing. So then when I went to college at University of Maryland in College Park, it was a completely different experience for a lot of reasons. I was then using Metro to get into DC all the time, biking around campus as my main form of transportation. And that really made me realize that the way that we build our communities is a choice. And I had grown up in a place that chose to be somewhere that I couldn't walk to the library or school, or was, in a suburban neighborhood with only a couple of other kids who we all kind of hated each other, but we had to hang out because we were the only people around. So that was what really opened my eyes, was going from one environment to then a very different environment and realizing, oh, hey, we can do this differently and bring places that work better for people to more communities.
That's great. How about you, Luca?
So I'd say in terms of, I don't have like a sexy answer. So I studied economics, and for a long time, for a few years, certainly in the course of looking for a home myself, with my dad's money. Like we got help from family, and even when it wasn't even like playing with our own money, we were like, this is crazy. It's way too much. I just knew that housing was the main expense for people, and it was clearly out of control. And if I had Googled it, Salim, I would have arrived at root causes a lot faster, but for everything there is a season. And so like my urbanist journey as such, and learning about urbanism and it becoming my passion, all of that has transpired in like generously 3 years, probably more like 2.5. And here I am with you lovely people. But I just, knowing that housing is the major expense for most people, and also a fundamental fact of your daily life, and that it was unaffordable, it just cried out to me as a serious problem that felt like it wasn't receiving the attention it deserved. And then I learned about land use and got radicalized about zoning, and kind of went from there.
That's great. So let's we're gonna bore some of you, the attorneys, for instance, but you bore us sometimes, so it's revenge, specifically attorneys. Let's talk about land use. So, Jane, you're a professional planner. Without giving us
by accident, not by a trade.
please don't tell us all you know. But what's the maybe for like regular person at home on their couch, there isn't like what is land use, and what are we talking about at all here, and B, why is this relevant to the housing discussion as opposed to maybe 17 other theories I could come up with?
All right, I'll try to be succinct because I don't want to bore people. But land use is essentially what we allow to be built on our land, how we use our land. The biggest aspect of that is its zoning. If something is zoned residential versus industrial versus commercial, or mixed use where you can do office, commercial, and residential all in one building, how exciting. And But there are more aspects to land use than just zoning, and there are more components to zoning than just how something is zoned to be used. So there are things like setbacks and height restrictions and floor area ratio that creates, how dense can a building be. So there are a lot of aspects to, parking requirements, for example. And the way that these all come together are that they are a mechanism to try to control what our communities look like and to make them be in a certain way of, we put the office buildings over here, we put the single family detached homes over here, and maybe we can put the apartment buildings over there. And that's how it's gone for a lot of US planning history since World War II especially, is separating those land uses. And when that happens, there are a lot of other problems that come out of that. You have the social problems of saying people who make different incomes, because if you can't afford to buy a single family house, then your options are to not live in that oftentimes more highly amenitized single family neighborhood. So you have the social issues that come from that lack of integration and not being able to access the same schools, the same community centers, have the same access to public safety institutions. So there's those aspects, there's the climate aspects of when things are separated from each other, then you have to drive everywhere. It's very difficult to walk somewhere when there's when uses are so far and spread out from each other, or to even take a bus a lot of times. The more low density our urban environment or suburban environment is, the more expensive it is to operate a bus system. So there's a million different problems that come out of using our land in inefficient ways, and that's why it's important to me.
Can I add on to that?
Sure, and I have a follow-up for you as well, Luca.
Okay, briefly, I think it's important to, and I'm like really not an expert. I'm just kind of the guy who's taken the most hits in the last year and a half. So I can talk about the conflict aspect if you want. But I think just one of the things that this whole experience has taught me, I have a classical liberal background, one of the things that this experience has taught me is that class warfare is a real thing. And the reason I say that is because if you want to really understand, like, where did all of this come from, I think the obvious answer is social control. Now, why do I say that? Because over the course of the early 20th century, and Salim's going to correct me if I get any of this wrong, I'm printing in very broad strokes here, as the Gilded Age was turning into the Progressive Era, there arose this desire for control over where certain people live. People of color, people of lower incomes. This is explicit. Over the course of the early first half of the 20th century, culminating in a 1948 SCOTUS decision that rendered unconstitutional or deemed unconstitutional racial discrimination in housing policy. There was a series of policies first very explicit, then gradually over time being pared back by legal rulings to control where people could live based on their race and also functionally based on their income through policies that made housing artificially expensive. So there's a New York Times stat that in the average American city, something like 70% of the land is restricted to detached single-family homes. And that was basically a form of, I would say, like economic, and I'm like sounding like a Marxist now, but like basically like a form of like economic and political warfare against certain classes of people. There's really salient examples of this. The highlight is probably this famous passage from something called the Euclid decision, which said that it was constitutional for municipalities to control zoning in the majority decision of the Supreme Court. And this was like, what, the 30s or something?
24-ish.
Thank you. The majority opinion says the apartment dweller is a mere parasite. That is in this, this is this case is like on the books, ladies and gentlemen. This is still the law of the land. Okay? Now, there was a racial undertone to the conflict there. There was a concern among the right kinds of people that apartment dwellers and row house dwellers would invade, so to speak, I'm paraphrasing here, their community. Another good example is the inception of single-family zoning or zoning as we understand it today, which happened in 2 places. One of them was in Berkeley, California, in 1916 or something. Okay, so this white property developer, I know I'm like, okay, this is kind of obvious.
Yeah,
but
back then, guys named Luca and Salim were not white. Let's
No.
be clear.
Yeah, and yeah, but yeah, we're not going to get into that, but that's true. You might have been okay, but your hair is pretty red though.
I'm Irish.
So
I don't know.
Need not apply.
Yeah.
This would have been like the diversity panel at a housing conference in 100 years ago.
Okay.
So basically, the white property developer basically got the city government in Berkeley to institute single-family zoning because he was worried that the white single-family neighborhood that he was developing would be encroached upon by 2 evil forces: a Chinese laundromats, and a black dance hall. That was the genesis of zoning in Berkeley, no less. So I'm not like really a social justice type, really. Like, my heart bleeds as much as anyone else's, but I think it's really important to understand the policies and systems that we're all dealing with and that have raised the water over all of our heads were designed to drown specific people, figuratively.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
So let's. I want to. It's easy for all of us. Like, the panel, we all agree on I think core issues here, and it, you guys are a friendly audience. I feel like we agree. We can sit here and talk about how like those people out there are bad all night. But let's talk about race and like a more critical aspect about ourselves. So, Luca, as an organizer, I mean, one of the things that's been obvious if you go to YIMBY events is that there's a lot of young, professional, white men, right? And like this, you could find exceptions to all those categories, but that's certainly like the stereotypical YIMBY.
Yeah.
I'm at least not young, but otherwise.
Compared to the standard public meeting, you're quite young.
That's true.
That's
true. I'm not an AARP member yet. I'm actually way ridiculously closer than you would think. They send out the letter when you're like 50. Come on, it's like insulting. Anyway,
We're coming for you, Salim.
I can say that here. We're in a safe space for people who don't want to be old. How do you? So as an organizer, obviously you're not going to turn people away, and also obviously like young professional white men are not the people whom the housing crisis has hit the hardest. So maybe why do you think that people like us, find this movement as something to kind of attach our free time or our professional time in some cases to? And then what have you been able to successfully, I'm sure YIMBY has tried lots of things, but how do we get this to my Ethiopian neighbors, my Salvadoran neighbors, and a lot of other people?
I have an awful lot of Ethiopian neighbors myself. I live near Southern Towers, and so it's something that's really on my mind. Also, like, the best thing about living in Northern Virginia and your part of Maryland is the great food and the great diversity of culture. So every organization has a weakness, and hands down, the biggest weakness of my organization after 2 years and a couple of months is the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in our leadership team. That's just obvious. Our president is a woman. She's a mother of 2. She is another Jane. I have a Jane too. Her name is Jane Green. She is an absolute freight train. She does the same amount of work as 2 or 3 other people. And had been in the trenches of housing fights in Arlington County by herself for about 5 years before we formed. I am second to no one in my adulation of her. We just added another female member of our core team, Phoebe, who has hit the ground running and hosting a social before public meeting tonight in Alexandria, which I obviously had a conflict for. We've had a few people of color on our team. 1 or 2 of them didn't last for very specific compartmentalized reasons that had nothing to do with the color of skin. But yeah, what you're saying is just obviously true, Salim. The basic theory for why YIMBYs look the way they do, and I'd say is and I want to be careful I say this because like I'm not trying to insult anyone or stereotype, but I mean, I got into this because I got into urbanism so quickly because I had an economics background. I studied economics in undergrad. I don't have a master's, so actually I'm like quasi undocumented living in Northern Virginia without like an advanced degree. we don't have to get into that. So like keep this to yourselves. And I don't do
PhD
yoga.
ICE is coming for you.
Yeah, PhD ICE is like definitely coming. Yeah, absolutely. They're overeducated, so they're not very well organized, so we'll be okay.
They're going to have committee meetings about you.
Yeah. That was pretty funny. So urbanism clicked into place for me really quickly because it really all boils down to use land efficiently. A lot of what we're talking about tonight, the policy problems, it's a political problem of reforming a system that is designed to use land inefficiently on the theory that people create negative externalities out of proportion when they're in like a sufficient mass. It really, if you like apply the lens of looking at all of this as, it's like the theory that people are pollution, like a lot of it makes a lot more sense. It's why like tall buildings will be near highways. It's why it's easier to build a tall building far out than close in. But yeah, I don't have like a great answer. I don't have like a clever comeback. Like it's clearly a problem. It's something we're trying to work on. I do think that one great thing about the YIMBY movement and about urbanism in general is that it's really apolitical and transcends ideology. Mm-hmm. So Jane and I have pretty different politics, I would say.
Probably.
We
don't talk about that part though.
Well, we're not.
There's too much to talk about housing. Yeah.
Well, I was hoping it would come up because I want to show people that like it's okay. It's okay for people to not agree about everything.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that makes me really hopeful about the YIMBY movement and about land use and supply side housing policy, that it's not something that requires ideological commitments.
Yeah, when you have Youngkin and AOC agreeing with each other, you know that there's something special. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but you know that there's something outside of the realm of normal U.S. politics happening, which I think is really exciting. And thanks for asking that question because I do think that it is one of the biggest challenges of the YIMBY movement, and there is a lot of distrust between communities of color and the largely white YIMBY activists, and I think that has a very good reason because the history of urban planning for so long was extremely racist. Planners were behind a lot of, the policies that Luca was talking about in the early 20th century, and then urban renewal in the 60s. And, there's just so many policies and programs that you can point to that haven't prioritized communities that are not white and communities that that are making lower incomes. And so it makes sense that now we say, we're doing this because it will help you, and there's some distrust there. So I think it's really important in my advocacy. I try to prioritize building relationships with some of the other organizations. I was talking earlier with somebody in the audience about, building those bridges with like tenant advocacy organizations, because at the end of the day, we have extremely similar goals of making sure that people are housed affordably and safely and can thrive and have a good place to live. So I've been trying to do that. It's we've had ups and downs and had bumpy roads, but I think it's a really important thing for white YIMBY activists to continue to do. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation of like, why is this type of person attracted to this solution? I think part of it is the if you liked Freakonomics like in high school, you probably will be like, whoa,
people are so good.
Oh, I'm sorry. The zoning theory of everything, you're probably going to be attracted to oh my gosh, all of these problems can be traced back to zoning, which, I have been zoning pilled significantly. So yeah, I am attracted to that line of thinking for sure. Part of the reason I am pretty social justice minded, and part of the reason why I have chosen to focus my career in activism on zoning is because I see it as the most efficient way to make people's lives better. but it's certainly a problem that I think that we're making more progress to. And I think one of the hardest things about doing this organizing sometimes is realizing that there are a lot of situations where I'm not the right messenger. And so it's a difficult balance, because then you don't want to find the one person who is the right messenger and say, please go be the messenger to all of these different communities, because there's, more like trust that you might be able to build than I can build. And so it's a lot of like things to balance, but it's important to keep in mind.
So I was gonna have all of you stand up and like turn and look at the Capitol, because it was beautiful in the sunset. And literally, my friends whom I love gave such long and eloquent answers. The sunset is now completed. I can't see the sun, but I can see the Capitol. I had the best seat in the house.
It's pretty that way.
Yeah, okay. Take a turn. We are in a gorgeous space at sunset, so use your swivel chairs and just like enjoy this city for a second.
Yeah.
That's great.
I love DC.
I mean, I used to be a congressional reporter, and I'm like a huge institutionalist. And so I saw the Capitol walking over here, and I was like, that's a beautiful building. We should make better use of it. But like really, honestly.
Tip your waitresses. Luca will be here all week.
It was a genuine emotion, and also I knew it was funny. So that's always a good mix, Caroline.
And you have permission to get up, get yourself a drink.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to get me a spindrift, that's also welcome. And there's some good food over there. Eat the chicken. There's a lot of
And
chicken.
can we give Emma a hand for organizing this
Yes.
really quick? Okay.
All right, so I wanted to go back to Jane. You talked already somewhat about kind of different people coming to YIMBYism from different angles. And in your introduction, there was a list of about 17 different groups, which you lead. Thanks. And let me think about how to phrase this. What have groups that aren't specifically housing or zoning focused learned in the past few years, and what do they still need to learn?
That's a really good question. It is really exciting that, like sort of realizing that, I am but a molecule floating on the on the sea of the universe, and I was brought to, YIMBYism at the same moment that a lot of other people were, because it is a movement that has been growing so much in just the past few years. So in the same way that we have been brought to it, and you were brought to it only just a handful of years ago, a lot of other people have been too. There's been a lot more writing about it in various different outlets from different political, ideological backgrounds. And so I think that has done a lot in the front of education. And so folks, when I say zoning, more people actually know what that means now, which is really exciting. But there's still a lot to learn about sort of like what are the next steps and how do we take those people and organize them, essentially. How do we connect them with the Montgomery for Alls, the YIMBY Novas? How do we get them learning about how to take those things that they might be thinking about or feeling or learning and get them in front of elected officials to talk to them? So I think that there's some lack of civic education about how to get involved or how to incorporate that into their existing advocacy, about how if they are somebody who's a part of Sierra Club, how do you incorporate that into your advocacy around like clean waste or clean waste, like all the other aspects about sustainability that they might be working on. So I think that's one step, is taking those folks and bringing them to the next stage, and also helping them to learn more about that history that Luca was talking about, and getting them to share that with their neighbors.
That's great. Emma, I don't know what the rules are, but I'd love to get more audience questions mixed in here, and then sort of mix and match my questions with theirs. Is that fine? No rules. Do they need to use a microphone? That's usually the rule. Or can they just spit it out?
We do not.
All right, great. Well, if there were people watching, that's the thing. My office, wait for the microphone. There's people at home. If they wanted to hear, they would have come to the office. All right. I stay home because I don't want to hear my colleagues. Phelan, don't tell anybody that.
Emily's lovely. Like, what are you talking about? Anyway.
So if you got a question, throw your hand up. I'd love to mix you guys in. I've got plenty more that I can quiz our panelists about. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been to a few events on zoning, and I find there's like always the joke at the beginning about how this is boring, but we're going to talk about it, and it never is. But I'm curious, how do we bring more people into the conversation? Like, how do we intrigue them from the get-go? Because I do find once I talk to anyone from any political perspective about this, they're like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. But how do we like open those initial doors?
Isn't it weird how like the zoning is boring has gotten to be it's like negative?
It's
like
not.
Right? Like it's very weird that we think it's not. I agree that it's not, but like historically it is.
You made the joke like you earlier. Did you not?
Anybody watch
does.
What We Do in the Shadows with like Colin Robinson going to the city? That's my like Twitter banner. Is like I have a lot of opinions about zoning ordinances.
So so what's your name?
Ethan.
So Ethan, I think I'm gonna go on a limb and say that the question under your question is why is there this kind of divide, right, between the people who like have no idea what's going on and the people who can't shut up about it. All right, so I have pondered this myself from being involved in the liberty movement for the last 13 years. Can't say that I am right now. And also from being, steeped in free market economics and as a college student and all that, like never encountered this stuff, right? Saw like a friend's high school thesis presentation on new urbanism, saw a, guest speaker at my business school on urbanism. That was it. I asked the chair of Gigi Wash's board, Greater Washington is a local group here, and I asked her one time, where's this divide coming from? Like, why is this? I think there's two reasons. So the one that's intuitive to me is if you don't know that all the things that you see around you are a policy choice, if you just kind of take the world as it is, you kind of take it for granted in its form, right? So it's why people conflate the ubiquity of single-family zoning with its popularity. Or like, I like to drive. Well, you've never done literally anything else, so do you know that you like to drive or not? It's fair to question. The part that my friend supplied to the answer, which I think might be more important and easier to miss, certainly for me, is that, and Jane, I'd love to hear you talk about this briefly, the professions that do this work, that do the technical work, or that make the political decisions around these issues are extremely there's a lot of gatekeeping, there's a lot of like certifications, like being a planner is like a very specific field, being a transportation planner, being a transportation engineer, a civil engineer, these are all professions that are very much like you follow these rules, you do things this way, right? And it's just, they like not having a lot of attention. They like making the decisions without a ton of public oversight. I'm not a populist, right? But there is an element of what we do in the shadows, actually.
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely true. Like, I think the first part is that people see the built environment and it feels so permanent, and they don't realize, sort of what I realized going from Calvert County to the DMV of like, oh, these are policy choices. And so that feels a lot more permanent, that these buildings are always going to be here than, say, my healthcare policy can change very quickly with like the whim of a pen, or my landlord can treat me better tomorrow. And so I think that there's a disconnect there between the like scale of the type of policy that we're talking about. And then I do think that second part is true. I went to one of my first planning conferences. My background is, I'm not a trained planner. My background is public policy, but I went to my first planning conference last week, and it was a little bit interesting to be steeped in that and all the technicality and around a lot of people who are not necessarily focused on like solving problems or like moving things forward, and we're more focused on, how can we design this thing in a way that is as confusing and technical and inaccessible as possible. So that's what I would say.
Great. Question in the middle.
Yeah, so you said that like this whole like what we do in the shadows type thing. So it seems like, a free press ought to be able to shine some light on that. Like, what are the developments that are happening now where we need more news stories, and what outlets are interested in running these stories?
Yeah. So go ahead.
What's so funny?
Yeah,
I thought it was a great question.
We're out of the joke here.
It's a very self-serving question.
Okay.
He's looking for
Can you
some
introduce
gigs.
yourself?
Oh, I'm Aaron Andrews. I'm the director of the Young Voices Contributor Program, and I would like the camera writers to write on this.
Sure.
Pitch them to those outlets to be published.
I think so.
I actually have a great answer to this.
Yeah.
So there's a college senior at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, named Zach Udishtu. I just agreed to be on this committee for his dissertation, as his undergrad thesis, whatever. He, as a senior in college, is doing some of the best technical reporting on local zoning proposals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great. I mean, Zach's a smart guy. He's great. He's doing good research. He's got a bright future. He's also a senior in college. There's a lot of really experienced reporters in America who write a zoning story that's something like
Young Voices.
Young Voices.
You got him. I'm going to go find this guy.
Yeah, I'm happy to make an introduction. He's trying to figure out what to do after college. He's great. He could get a PhD. He's super smart. But right, it's like he's super smart, but he's still like he doesn't have a lot of experience. The experienced reporters, right? There was a meeting about some zoning stuff. They give you a vague thing as a researcher. I read it. I'm like, what's the proposal? I have no idea what the proposal is. And instead, you spend 4 sentences telling me what 2 neighbors said in favor and in opposition. Right. Right? And like that gives me no information. And if I'm a newspaper reader, I basically have nothing substantive to go on except do I identify with the quote from the pro or the quote from the con?
Can I just briefly say, like, kind of the kernel of your question? I don't mean to keep doing the same trick, but like, there's kind of a premise of that question is like, who's going to solve this problem? Like, we are. Like, the people in this room are going to solve this problem. This is something that has to be participatory. And before I go, like,
you didn't know what you signed up for when they gave you.
Sorry. Well, no. Like, people keep assuming 2 things: that my group is more than 2 years old, and that it is my job. And neither of those things are true. People are like, you are like bought and paid for. I'm like, I wish, but that is not how it works. Like, I wish, right? Your question? No?
Oh, I guess to respond to. Were you going to respond to that?
Did you have something to say on the person?
Yeah.
Not everybody has to answer.
Well, can I briefly, like, slogans aside, like, I view my responsibility for my group as to like cultivate the media where I am. Like, I'm getting in the ear of Margaret Barthel. I'm getting in the ear of Teo Armas, the WAMU reporter, the Washington Post reporter, right? Like, we're sending press releases. We're being disciplined. Like, there's no, like, oh, like, I wish someone would just, like, tell the story and then people would care. I actually don't think that's true. Like, I don't want to go afield, but, the situation in California makes what we're dealing with look like Disney World. Like, it's a horrible situation. There are people sleeping in the parks. There are people sleeping in their cars all the time. It's very common, right? It's like an average experience now for you to spend a few years in college sleeping in your car. The people who make decisions about land use there, the neighbors who comment on, the approval of some apartment project, they do not care. They do not care. They have theirs, that's it. End of the conversation. Oh no, the shadows might hurt my plants. Like, stuff like that. So, like, I question, like, it's important for us. Now, that gets me as fired up as anyone else. Like, I'm sure some of you are ready to, like, drive to California right now. But like, it's really important for us to have a positive vision and to, like, offer people something. We can't just say, this is so horrible and we need to fix it. No, there is a better way of living that comes from, to piggyback off something Jane said, like, what excites me about this the thing that made me be like, this is what I will do with the rest of my life, was this is very simple formula to have like a much better way of life. Like, you are more physically active, you're more socially connected, the economy is great, the environment is great, all the forest is saved. It's like, right? Like, who doesn't want that, right? When you lay it all out. And the best part about it, ladies and gentlemen, is it doesn't require us to discover anything. It doesn't require us to invent new technology. We just do what people in the 1910s did. We just like build cities.
World War One.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. No, not that. Don't do that.
Well, speaking of old Europe, like that pattern of land use. No, stay with me here. That pattern of the reason I brought this up, that pattern of land use was just the norm in human history. Now, that's partially because of transportation technology, and like for most of human history, people would only walk around, so places had to be dense, they had to be compact. But sprawl is not something that would ever happen unless there was a law that said you have to build that way. Because it wastes land. It costs money, and it forces private individuals and private businesses to spend money in a wasteful way. It would not happen on its own.
Carolyn had a question.
Yes.
Introduce yourself and where you work if you ask a question. Come on, we're all friends here.
Carolina. So, I understand both of you have been involved in GIMBY organizing on the ground in like blue suburbs of DC. I'm curious, Luca, you kind of got into the genesis of zoning, but those are not arguments that could fly in these suburbs today, at least sort of without a lot of
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what arguments you're hearing against building more housing, and what arguments you found were persuasive against them.
What context?
Let's let Jane jump in.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't think it'll be anything too surprising. The arguments that we've heard against, I imagine they're very similar. What about the trees? What about the parking? Our schools are already overcrowded. Stormwater management, everything is going to flood if we allow more apartment buildings. I once heard an argument that it would make the streets more crowded, and then an ambulance wouldn't be able to get to this elderly man's house, and he would die. I've heard a lot of different arguments. I think that those listed at the beginning are probably the most common. Am I forgetting any major ones there?
I mean, yeah, no.
What I hear from people a lot when, because I do like to talk about the history of zoning and how it relates to both class and race. But it is hard to talk about because then people immediately are like, well, why are you calling me racist? There's an Asian family, a black family, et cetera, who live in my neighborhood. And so I have tried to talk more, because Montgomery County is a very diverse place, about the class aspects. Yeah. Because it might be a very diverse place, but it's still very segregated, both racially and economically. But I do think that the arguments that have worked more, a lot of people do, I think, respond positively to the efficiency and sort of financial efficiency arguments, the more sort of like Strawn Towns arguments, if anybody reads that. I think people, it's been harder and harder for folks to argue with us, I think, because we have so much data on our side. So huge props to folks like Salim and the Mercatus Center who are doing that research that can arm advocates like me and Luca, so we can, basically flood folks with, studies and papers and articles and research, basically saying like, these concerns that you have, like, I see where they're coming from. A lot of times they can be very genuine, but at the end of the day, your fears are not going to pan out. And here's, 17 papers telling you why and case studies.
Oh, Emma, go ahead. I was going to take the next question, but Emma preempts me.
No, well, I was going to say, I'm actually curious from all of you what you think is the best argument from the other side.
Wow, that was literally my question.
Great minds.
Okay, so Side note on your question, I kind of question the premise that it's that important to change people's minds. If someone's dedicated opposition, like I just am gonna beat them. Like some people are very ingrained. The people who are the most upset tend to be older. It's hard for them to change their ways. Like there's a number of reasons. Like your audience when you're debating is always neutral observers. So, and also building coalitions is really important. You're going to try to in Arlington, we had a coalition that had the Sierra Club, the NAACP, the Chamber of Commerce, Young Democrats, a interfaith group, So at a certain point, it's like, I don't care what you have, I brought more. Like, it doesn't matter. So your question, Emma, what's the best argument against? The United States has a big problem running transit systems efficiently, I would say, certainly compared to the rest of the developed world. So one of the fundamental issues of density and like having people live in a dense enough way that they're using land efficiently enough that housing is affordable is everyone can't drive by themselves all the time. Doesn't work. Some of the solutions to this are surprisingly cheap and I think are just a matter of time. Like e-bikes make me very optimistic. I drove an e-bike today on a highway. I crossed a highway. It was terrible, but there were, in general, it was a pretty cool experience. And even like a terrible e-bike experience is still like way more enjoyable than just going along in a car. But I think the basic answer, to your question, Emma, is land use is the places where you spend time and how you get between those places. And we're not very good at the second part in America. We're not very good at running transit systems. We're not very good at investing in them. The capital investments, we tend to spend too much. We're not efficient at operating them in an effective way. We spend a lot on operating them.
I would say that part of that, though, is due to our poor land use decisions.
Absolutely.
Because they're so inextricably intertwined.
Yeah, I mean, you can't separate the two. But I think that's the most valid critique. They're like, oh, we're just going to a lot of people are still going to drive, right? So
my response would also be related to, transit came to mind as well, but to sort of government not delivering its services as effectively as possible, related to the schools, but also public resource arguments. I look to a place like Montgomery County in the 1980s was growing at an incredibly faster rate than it's growing now and ever has. And we were able to, build new schools and build new roads and provide all of these public services. And folks oftentimes have a difficult time imagining us doing that again. And I think that that's due in part to lack of an imagination, but I also think that that's due in part to, somewhere like Montgomery County, there are a lot of schools that have that need huge capital improvements and haven't gotten the type of money and investment that they need and deserve. So I definitely understand those concerns when people have seen government not deliver, if they think that it's understandable that they wouldn't think it could do even more than what it's already doing.
For me, differently, I actually think the timing critique is really valid. Actually, somebody brought this up at the meeting we were at today, Jane. There's very little that zoning can do for you this year. Mm-hmm. And even maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the future, it's going to be a couple of years. If I say, I'm going to come to your city, I'm going to solve your housing expense problem by rezoning, it's going to be a solid 5 years from the beginning of that process till you see any change in rent. And I think people legitimately say, well, we need a Band-Aid right now. I know this is not a long-term fix, but we're in a crisis. And then related to that, say more on the econ side, I think it's perfectly valid to say, short-term fluctuations in housing price are mostly demand-driven. They're supply changes really slowly, and there's just not that much happening. Even a rapidly building city like Houston or Dallas isn't building enough to keep up with their highest highest demand years. So we really saw this with COVID, where suddenly everybody wanted more residential space. People who were doubled up with roommates and had to work from home, they split up and went to separate places. It was an enormous amount of that. An enormous amount of young families saying, okay, well, we've been in a 2-bedroom apartment, but now that people need to work from home, we have to get a large house. And so suddenly there's this enormous expansion in the demand for residential space, which went along with the decline in the demand for commercial space, 25% vacancy rates all across the US right now. Those price hikes were not supply driven. It wasn't that supply got interrupted in the spring of 2020, we lost the building season. That's true in a lot of places, but that wasn't the main thing going on. The main thing was really low interest rates, really high demand for residential space, and then government stimulus to help everyone afford it. There's nothing that YIMBYism can do to stop those hikes. What we can do is make it so that it's a 25% price increase from a low base instead of a 25% price increase from a high base, right? And that's the best we can do is we can just move the whole roller coaster down, and which is really big, really important. You would way rather be in looking at Bentonville prices than DC prices if you're going to ride a roller coaster. But I think that's a very valid critique, and I don't honestly have a oh no, YIMBYism is going to get you price decreases by May.
I think the answer is the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is
now.
Right.
These guys are smart. More questions. Get yourself more food. Don't feel like you're glued to your seats. All right, we've got the whole front row. I'm going to start here and move that way.
Okay. Hi, my name is Me2. I actually focus a lot on education issues, so this is very new to me, and I'm kind of just absorbing a lot of things. I'm on Wikipedia right now because I just wanted to get an idea of exactly what NIMBY is, what the pros and cons are.
Okay.
I'm reading here that some of, and these are things that I've read in the news, so these are the things I'm thinking.
We're all friends here.
Do you have, what would you say, it seems like there are certain concerns with NIMBY. I've heard the pros. I'm interested in the cons and your reaction to it. Some are concerned that when NIMBY introduces gentrification, and then NIMBY also...
YIMBY?
YIMBY, my bad. YIMBY. Something with low-income housing. I have no idea if those two things are similar or not.
Okay, so I'm going to try to take that. So when people talk about gentrification, what they're really usually talking about is displacement. Current residents cannot afford to stay where they live. And the archetype people are imagining is lower income, probably people of color, who have been there a long time. The rent goes up, property taxes increase, right? And then they have to leave. So I'm going to give you I think because this is a friendly enough audience, I can give you the empirical answer, sort of. There's a lot of research that Salim can get into if we need to, that new development, whether we're talking at the hyperlocal level or the region level, on balance tends to reduce displacement because it gives people places to go. So the big thing hanging over this conversation is that there's an honest-to-God shortage, insufficient supply of housing that's causing a lot of weird things, right? It's why you could see, a one neighborhood, if it's kind of the green flag is wave for development there, everything shoots up, the people get scattered, it's like a geyser, right? Well, it's because there's such pent-up demand or lack of, I'd say pent-up supply actually, there's huge demand. So that's not now, that is a hard story to tell. I am not going to go to Anacostia and be hey guys, I have this study and everything's gonna be okay. Mm-hmm. They would tell me to pound grass. That's not right. These are really hard conversations to have, and it's really important for folks like myself, folks like Jane, to listen respectfully, learn, get the perspective, earn trust, go to bat for the priorities of other civic groups, right, that have that mission. But that's how I would talk about gentrification. I would really talk about it as displacement, and displacement is an economic issue. The basic question you always have to ask yourself is what place do people have to go? Where are they going to go? And so if you don't have young, some of you folks in the audience here, young, fabulous, you just got out of school, the world's at your feet, and you're if you don't have that shiny new apartment tower to move into, right? If there's not space in a place like that, you might go hunting for a place to live in. the lower income neighborhood where maybe you're splitting a duplex or something, and like maybe you then are displacing like Auntie Joe from like who lives there for 30 years, right? Like that's how displacement happens. It's because people don't end up somewhere else, they go there.
It's because there is not that shiny new apartment building. But the problem is that folks see the shiny new apartment building and then they think that's why rents are increasing, when really the rents were going to increase anyways. And we have a lot of great research, I'm glad you brought that up, showing that no, actually that shiny new apartment building is helping your rents. Maybe they're still going up, but they're going up at a slower rate than they otherwise would have if it wasn't built. But it's hard to make that argument about what would have happened if that apartment building wasn't built. I think DC is an excellent example because DC has experienced a lot of both gentrification and displacement. I do think that there is an aspect of like cultural gentrification that a lot of folks feel and is very real, of like if you have lived in a neighborhood and it was, had a lot of, it's little Ethiopia or something like that, and then it does start to change, that can be really difficult too, despite people not being displaced. But yeah, DC is a great example of, take like U Street, for example, or Noma. Like we opened up development in DC in a lot of these places that were historically Black and African American neighborhoods. Where did we not open up development? Everything west of Rock Creek Park in the much whiter, much wealthier neighborhoods. And so I think when we talk about gentrification and displacement, it's also important to look at where are we allowing housing to be built and where aren't we?
And we want housing to be allowed everywhere. Like I think the big point of the YIMBY movement is that it envisions growth as something that's broad-based and that isn't like, there's no off-limit zones. Now, I think this is like a little in the weeds, but I think it's important to acknowledge. So I was talking to folks at GG Wash, like, well, why were you hesitant about YIMBY? Years ago when this started. This all started in like 2015, 14 maybe, like not that, pretty recently. And there was a perception that because, like a lot of these initial fights happened in San Francisco, that's where the movement started. Right, and I have like good relationships with some of those people. Like I'm not trying to criticize them, but there was a perception that they would just like push for development wherever they could, and the places where it was easiest to push and where they could get the most done was the places where people couldn't push back. And so there was this, and Salim can probably talk to that history a little more, but like that was a real thing that happened, and it was like a real early dynamic of the YIMBY movement in the Bay Area. And so, like, now, like, we chose to name our group YIMBY Nova after, like, a lot of internal deliberation and, like, asking our members what they thought. The term doesn't really have baggage here. And people either have not heard of it or if we explain it, they like it. And it's positive, right? Yes. But, yeah, that's what you're talking about is a real thing.
It's great. Sir.
My name's Ben Ayanian. I'm here with Young Voices as well. I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about Houston, because I'm pretty sure Houston doesn't have any zoning laws. They do have some rules on how like buildings can be subdivided, but could you explain maybe quantitatively
you've been training your whole life
how
for
it
this.
might be better if it is better than most major cities?
Yes, Houston expert here. So Houston, Houston and Tokyo are probably like the two world cities that get the most YIMBY love as places that are kind of extremely permissive. And I'll say sort of the pros and cons that I think you see in Houston. So Houston, for some very curious historical reasons, ended up with a provision in its charter that it couldn't be zoned unless there was a vote of the populace. And it had to win a referendum. And the city, right, like the sort of technocratic people running the city were like, we're so backward. We have oil refineries and nobody's telling the oil refineries where to be. I wish we could have zoning. So 3 times they brought referenda. And so it was like the city bureaucracy trying to convince its citizens, please vote for zoning, we want to do this. And they rejected it all 3 times. The last time was pretty narrow. And honestly, if the city had kept pushing, I think it could have won. The last time was in 93, and it was like 43-57, something like that. They probably could have won if they tried again and kept pushing on like we need to be a normal city, just like all the other cities and have zoning.
No.
But there's a few things you learn from that. For one thing, the idea that zoning deregulation is pushed by white elites really doesn't hold up if you look at the vote analysis there, where the whiter, more affluent homeowner neighborhoods voted for zoning, and the poorer Hispanic and Black neighborhoods voted against zoning. So we have like solid, like, if you, instead of paying attention to like the 3 people who show up at a meeting where Jane has to present her work on a Tuesday night in Rockville, if you actually look at people who show up at the polls, which is not everyone, but it's a much broader slice of the people who live in a given place, it does not at all look like this is like zoning is popular with lower income renters. So that's one of the immediate lessons from Houston is like, it's like the only city in America that said, hey, should we actually do this? Now, I think if you went to most American cities that have zoning now and you said, should we get rid of it, people would also say no, because that would be too much change all at once. They wouldn't know what would happen, right? Because once you've got like a dam and you say, we don't know what's on the other side of this dam, should we knock it down? Like, you'd be an idiot to say yes, right? Like, you don't know. But when you're in Houston, you're like, there's no dam, should we build a dam? You're like, no, actually things are working pretty well, and I'm pretty sure this dam is going to be built by people who don't like me to hurt people like me. And so I think that's like, before we get into all like the weeds of like what Houston has done, that's like a really, really big lesson from Houston. And I really wish more American cities had asked permission or had some kind of debate about this. And then the other big thing with Houston is, there's 3 lessons. That's one. Number 2 is they really, after that 93 vote, I don't know if they changed personnel or what, but city staff said, okay, we're going to be the permissive city. And they started dismantling some of the rules they did have on the books, which were large lot sizes for single family homes, and parking requirements that were quite excessive. And then as of like a week ago, a sort of pseudo zoning that like maybe if the Pacific Legal Foundation wanted to sue them and say like you're actually breaking the law, this is zoning. They have a system where once you subdivide something to be single family or duplex homes, it goes from being what they call a reserve to being a lot. And no one there can tell me what it takes to turn a lot back into a reserve. Once it's a reserve again, you can build commercial structures, you can build multifamily housing. But once it's a lot, you can't build multifamily housing. So they do kind of actually sneaky have zoning. You might want to sue them. And if you do, they just like do the right thing, I think. They're like, we're getting sued. Oh no, we have to allow multifamily housing. So they've started to dismantle. And we've seen the results. Like there's probably like 40,000 infill houses on small lots that have been built. Nobody in America knew that what Americans wanted was no backyard and a townhouse, but it's not actually touching the neighbor because Americans don't want to touch. And we had zoning that allowed townhouses. We had zoning that allowed big spaces between neighbors. And it turned out what Americans want is just like the minimum amount of space, but it's just got to be air between us. Like,
which is actually very Japanese.
Yes, it's super. So there's a thing in Japan called mini kaihatsu, which means mini development. And it's a loophole in Japanese law, and it's basically identical to now what Houston builders built. Very weird. I don't know. There's meaning in this. I've done a bunch of research on that. If you Google resources for reformers, Houston minimum lot sizes, you'll get like all the research on this, which I compiled. I did one of the papers, but there's lots by other people. The third lesson from Houston, Jane, this is to make you uncomfortable, is that when you allow all kinds of development, lots of sprawl still happens. Now their sprawl is not nearly as sprawly as, say, Massachusetts, where I grew up, where it's 1 acre lots going across half the state. Houston fits like twice the number of people in the same area as suburban Boston. Wow. Because they do 6,000 square foot lots, just mile after mile after mile of those. But it's very driving oriented. It's walkable in the sense that you can walk your dog. There's sidewalks in the subdivisions, but you're not going to leave your subdivision on foot unless you're fleeing someone or something. And I think a lot of YIMBY urbanists would really like, Lucas said this before, I don't agree with him, would like it to be true that if
you're only like an expert, so.
Well, I mean, but it's counterfactual, so I could be wrong, but like,
no,
if we removed a lot of rules and we removed highway subsidies and yada yada, would Americans still want to live on land on a car oriented if they have to pay for everything related to their car? And I think the answer is still yes. A lot of Americans really would want to live in Calvert County.
Oh no, that doesn't make me uncomfortable at all. I was actually going to disagree with Luca when you said that earlier.
Man,
so
guys, I'm out.
with you.
You've been outvoted, Luca. You're
Well,
off the island.
I mean, I never claimed to be the expert.
And that's why I do think that there is still space for some sort of zoning. Like, I do think that, like, I am sometimes alone in the Montgomery County YIMBY spaces of defending the agricultural reserve. And I do think that there are arguments against it. Like, I can see some of the, it's caused development to just leapfrog to Frederick. Like, I can totally understand that. But I do think that there are applications for zoning within both conservation, and now, because we have such bad zoning laws, to intentionally zone in ways to hopefully improve equity.
I mean, the big issue, not like, here's the deal, folks. I'm just a guy. She's in the profession. He's an expert. So, like, go with what they said. But with that like self-immolation out of the way, I think the important thing to note here, it's not like, oh, we like hate sprawl. I mean, I don't think anyone here likes sprawl particularly. Maybe Salim does a little bit, but like, I think the real issue is there's a desired demand for denser living, for townhouses, for 5/1s, for apartments, and that is not met because those things are illegal in many places in America.
That's why they're so expensive.
Right.
Because we don't have a lot of
Or
them.
like walkable neighborhoods are like this luxury amenity because there's just not that many of them, right? So like I think the takeaway, one of your takeaways tonight, I hope, is not, wow, those people like hate cars and are like whatever. Like, we're for something, right? Like the vision of what we're advocating, and this is a more or less free market audience. I mean, this is something I do feel confident kind of just generalizing about. A lot of the good land use choices that we would like to see would happen organically as market outcomes. Because again, using land efficiently, like the economic drive to do that causes certain things to happen, right? It's like why cities exist.
I want to go to my last front row question here from this awesome section of the front row.
Thank you. My name is Sophia Hamilton. I'm at the Cato Institute, and I'm here with Young Voices. So Salim, a couple of questions ago, you were talking about the critiques of zoning being that it just takes forever to see real change. So I wanted to know your guys' opinions on inclusionary zoning, because I know that it's always critiqued by libertarian scholars because it does coerce private businesses to have lower priced units, but when it takes years for zoning reforms to go through and then to see those housing being built, what would be a better solution?
So first, let me just frame the question. Inclusionary zoning is a requirement that's become popular. It's actually invented here in Fairfax and Montgomery County, where if you build a building of a certain size, you have to set aside some number of the units to have a deed restriction that they're available for people of a lower income, and you can only charge those people 30% of their income. So they give you their like 1040 or whatever every year and say, this is my adjusted gross income, you can only charge 30% of that. And if they increase their income, you can raise their rent equivalently, but that deed restriction runs with the property either perpetually or often for the first 30 years, at which point it's sort of presumed that the building has moved down enough in the market that it's going to be organically affordable, which happens if you're building at a decent rate. And yeah, you're right. There's a lot of critiques. I mean, on the timing thing, I'm sorry, taking this question, guys. On the timing thing, I don't think so. IZ takes as long to work as any other kind of zoning, right? Because you're waiting for buildings to get built, and Montgomery County has been very successful with IZ for a number of reasons, highly competent planning staff among them, but most IZ programs in the country just produce vanishingly few units.
Yeah.
And they either just, developers say, well, I'm not gonna touch that, or they find some gimmick to get out of it, or they get a variance away from it because they're like, look, I'm not gonna build anything at all if I have to do this money-losing proposition. So I would say it's been mostly a failure. My view of like, if you want to help people, give them money, right? Like, among other things, you can actually target that money to the people who need it the most, as opposed to the IZ program, which is like, okay, you've got a building manager who's like, okay, I gotta find somebody whose income matches this, who's well documented their income so that they can show up and prove that their income is that low.
Right.
Because, you know, God forbid you lost your documents, well, sorry, you can't qualify even if you're obviously poor. And then they want to cream the crop and find among their applicants the person who's going to fit in culturally, who's not going to be disruptive, maybe who doesn't have little kids. So one of my best friends actually lived in an IZ apartment in Boston. He was a pastor. So his income was very low because he's running a church. It's essentially like you know, he could have been earning a lot more money if he'd been in the private sector. But he had a low income because he'd chosen to do this missional job, and he was a perfect fit for this building because they're like, great, we have an IZ unit and we filled it with someone who's going to behave culturally just like everybody else in the building. So IZ is not actually that great at achieving this idea of like, oh, we're gonna integrate places, as opposed to give people some money and let them go out in the market and buy what they need.
Although that's also not always great at achieving the integration.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, do you?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that, I mean, I do think that IZ, especially in Montgomery County and other like hot markets, has been helpful to achieve some sort of economic integration that wouldn't have otherwise happened. I agree basically with everything that Salim said there. I do think that, and a lot of those arguments that you're referencing, I think like definitely have legs, although there are a million ways to craft an IZ program. No jurisdiction has the same program. And so in that way, there are ones that can be a lot more burdensome onto the developer than others. And part of the idea of that type of policy is that if you're giving enough of a density bonus, it will offset the cost of having to provide those below market rate units. So as with a lot of housing policies, I think that there's a way that you can hit that good balance where you're achieving those like public policy goals and not being a burden onto the private market. But I definitely wouldn't say that, you know, every IZ policy achieves that.
Okay, I'm gonna try not to like hurt anybody when I'm saying this, but this is probably gonna be the hot take of the night.
Ooh.
So, as I was alluding to before, ladies and gentlemen, we have like a massive shortage just hanging over all of us, right? So there's about 160,000 in the realm of shortage of units in the DC area. Inclusionary zoning and like the real policy represents, which is committed affordable housing, like if there's like a low-income person who gets that unit and like is able to build a life in like probably a high-opportunity neighborhood, that's a great thing. I think my personal frustration with those policies is it allows people with political power to like have the gold shovel and like, you know, cut the ribbon, and they can be like, look, we're fixing the problem. But the buildings have enormous waiting lists. There's a huge unmet need. Now, part of that is because the rents are below market rates, so you're going to attract like a huge number of people. But like that's just true of any apartment, right? Like, or you know, a house will go on Zillow and 300 people have bookmarked it the next day. Ask me how I know. And so, like, I get that these are really important programs. A lot of really good people, really good, decent people work very, very hard doing that instead of doing something else that they could be doing to make those programs work. And they do good in the world. We need a bigger boat, in my opinion. So, like, that's why I'm first and foremost a YIMBY. Because, like, the only way we're going to fix this is if we stop handing out life preservers a dozen at a time and actually start building some boats for people.
Good, we've got maybe time for one or two more questions. Yes, all the way to the back.
I'm Amanda Kiefer. I'm also here with the Young Voices crew. There's several of us who may have noticed. I'm still kind of like new to this concept of NIMBYism and some of the housing. I'm vaguely familiar with some of the zoning. But I'm trying to, I guess, wrap my head around vision a little bit. So are you all, like, when you're talking about some of this vision for increasing housing, like, are we thinking that this increase in housing is just like apartment units? Like, are we looking looking at like ownership? Like what is this kind of like vision? Because I'm hearing like a lot of like density, it's very cities focused. I grew up in a more rural area. Like how does this apply to other kinds of like communities?
Jane, can you take this? Let's keep it to one answer so we can get to one more question.
Sure, yeah. No, I mean, I think that there are a lot of great examples of sort of like Main Street, like rural urbanism. I think in Maryland of like Middletown, Maryland, a lot of sort of like the Western Maryland areas. But yes, it is oftentimes more urban in form, even if it is still a single family detached house. You go to those like Main Street communities, they're like built closer to the like front property line. They're not as set back as far. They're really close to where that Main Street area is that you can walk to, the barber, to your office, to wherever you need to go. So it's not, I mean, I think that there is sometimes a rift, I don't want to call it a rift within YIMBYism, but the folks that are just like, build it anywhere you want, like greenfield development where you're essentially, taking, there's like greenfield development and then there's infill development where you're taking an existing sort of place and building it versus greenfield is like you're buying some person's farm that they're selling and you're building a huge subdivision of what we've seen a lot of in America. I would not advocate for greenfield development because it leads to, I think, a lot of other problems, a lot of the inefficient use of land that Luke is talking about, a lot of the challenges that we're seeing with climate change and the connection to transportation. But I think that there are certainly people within the YIMBY movement that would say, sure, greenfield development is fine too. But I do think that there are still ways to say, you're not going to become DC, but maybe we can go back to some of those more traditional types of towns and communities that folks lived in before. That's a lot of like the Congress for New Urbanism, a lot of that sort of like more traditional, strong towns too, traditional urbanist movement.
Jayla?
So I'm Jayla, staff attorney for On Border. One of the things that I think a lot of people, especially families, are concerned about is that if you give them a chance, they'd probably take a large detached single-family home in a suburb rather than an apartment, mainly because those kinds of apartments don't exist. What is the sort of the level of advocacy that's being provided to sort of address the fact that at least for like many low-income families, those kinds of housing opportunities, units that would exist, don't exist right now in the market, and how it's sort of is filling in the gap of those housing.
So wait, are you saying that the detached house for them doesn't exist, or like a family-sized apartment doesn't exist?
Sounds like you're talking about missing middle.
The family-sized apartment doesn't exist, and ultimately the preferential choice for most people, because it doesn't exist, is the single family.
Yeah. Luca, want to take this?
Yeah. So I think. Okay. I think the concept you're referring to is the missing middle. So this is the idea that you have a lot of detached single-family homes, you have a lot of high-rises, you don't have much in between. Fun fact, I've always lived in missing middle housing in DC, with the exception of a room in a single-family home that was functionally a multiplex, just with a bunch of dudes living in it. So
Dudeplex, we call that.
It was a dudeplex. It absolutely was. Yeah. Okay, so there's like good news and bad news. The good news is Arlington County, I don't know if you're local, but Arlington County's missing middle housing reform was like a step toward legalizing multiplexes on thank you, Arlingtonian right over here. A step towards legalizing multiplexes and actually clusters of 3 townhomes.
Wait, and a multiplex is not a theater where you go watch
movies. So a multiplex is like a duplex, or imagine a duplex, but it's a fourplex, quadplex. Like a little hallway, and like you go up the stairs to your units,
Cottage clusters.
Sure. And so, like, the good news is there is a vision for that. There are reforms. The bad news is, and Salim can fill in the details here, I'm throwing out a lot to y'all because you know what you're talking about. These reforms there's very few instances of them producing a lot of new units and growth. Often that's because you might be allowed to have 4 units on a lot, but you still have like large setbacks, height restrictions, and things like that maybe make it like economically less viable to build that type of housing, or you still get like a big profit from like a rich family giving you like $3 million or $2 million for a mansion, right? So it's going to take a lot of other reforms probably to make that kind of housing viable. But, that all sounds pretty complicated. You know what's simple? Townhouses. Townhouses are very easy to build. They have a lot of the attractive features of a single-family home. I live in a townhouse right now. The walls are soundproof. It's great. And, you can have a little front yard. You can have a little backyard. People debate like you would not believe about which way the garage should face. But, it's a really great form, right, of housing, one that gets a little bit overlooked. Townhouses are coded as the people on the right side of the tracks live in that. Row houses are coded as the people on the wrong side of the tracks live in that. There maybe is a technical definition based on how wide they are of the distinction.
I think it's all marketing.
They're the same thing.
Yeah.
They're the same thing. A Baltimore row house and an Alexandria townhouse are pretty much the same thing. So, townhouses...
Give or take $1 million.
Sure. And the job market and whatever. But, the point here is, there's missing middle, reforms that are focused on multiplex housing and duplexes and things like that. Those are going to take some time. It's going to take many bites at the apple, just as we saw with ADUs in California. There's also, within that, kind of overlooked townhouses as a model. They're, like I said, very inexpensive for builders to build. They have a lot of desirability. They get a good return when you build them. So I think townhouses, so Salim's colleague, Emily Hamilton, who I'm buddies with, I asked her one time, so do we need towers everywhere to fix this? And she was like, you know what? If we just had townhouses and 5-over-1s, in a lot of places, we'd be okay. So that's, and I'll close this out by talking about what a 5-over-1 is really quick.
Inspiring.
I know. Anticlimactic, I know. A 5-over-1, it refers to type 1 and type 5 building materials, basically a concrete pedestal of 1 or 2 stories, and then typically up to 5, but sometimes up to 7, I believe, stories of wood construction. America builds a lot of things out of wood because we have a lot of tall trees that Europe doesn't do that because they cut down all their trees before they had the Industrial Revolution. That's why they build everything out of stone. So 5-over-1s are a cheap way to build mid-rise apartments. And that's why you hear the term a lot. People love to hate them, but it's just a building, and it is an inexpensive way to build a lot of housing.
Great. We're going to be around, I think. We'd love to talk to you more. I have business cards. You guys should have brought business cards. And we want to give you guys a hand. Thank you for being a great audience.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll take it. Thank you guys. It was wonderful. Really, I mean, so much in-depth policy that just what I love about these round robin events is that we kind of get you to just talk and do your expert thing, and we get to hear it, which is nice. It wouldn't be a Young Voices event if I didn't plug Young Voices. I know most of you people are already somewhat familiar with Young Voices or are literally in it. But if you aren't, which I think is 3 of you, you should look it up. And if you're interested in writing on policy or just generally things that are sort of kind of like what they were talking about, whatever your policy area is, we're a good option for that. We help people get published. We help people get on TV and radio. We've done it for many years, and we hope to do it for many more. But guys, can we give it up for these folks? So good. So interesting. Yeah, please stick around for, our time is actually limited, 15 minutes. Eat that stuff, please. We have a lot more. So if you feel like you haven't had dinner, which I bet a lot of you haven't, that's a good solution. We also have a lot of drinks, so go for it. Go ham the next 15. But yeah, thanks for coming.